Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jill Kagan with the ARCH National Respite Network and Resource Center. And I want to thank you all for joining today's webinar on respite for family caregivers of individuals with brain injury, exploring new partnerships. For those of you who may not be familiar with ARCH, and because we are partnering and co-hosting this event with the National Association of State Head Injury Administrators, there are a lot of you on the call who may not know who we are. We are funded by the Administration for Community Living to house the Lifespan Respite Technical Assistance and Resource Center that supports the Lifespan Respite Grantees. And I'm going to be talking a little bit later in the presentation about what the Lifespan Respite Care Program is. Our affiliated state respite coalitions, all of their partners. We also provide general training and technical assistance to just about anyone who's interested in respite, including family caregivers. Just overall, a broad range of resources, from fact sheets to guidebooks to a national respite locator service, as well as policy information through our National Respite Coalition. Just a couple of housekeeping tasks before I get started. You may have noticed that all the participant audio has been muted. You do have the capacity to unmute yourselves at any time, but please, we'd greatly appreciate it if you keep yourselves muted, remain muted during the course of the presentations. We will be monitoring questions in the chat platform, so feel free to type in your questions at any time as you think of them, but we will hold off until everyone has made their presentations to respond to the questions and engage in any discussion that you might want to talk about some of the issues you heard about. I'm getting lots of questions in the chat. The webinar is being recorded and it will be available for viewing once it's been archived. It really should just be a day or two, and we'll notify everyone who registered by email when it's available. And after we get started, a little bit into the webinar, I'll post the link to the PowerPoint presentations in the chat platform so that you can download them and have a copy of the PowerPoints for yourselves as well. Next slide, please. I am really so grateful to have joined in this partnership. And we have today from the National Association of State Head Injury Administrators, Susan Vaughn, who's the Director of Public Policy, and Rebecca, if I've mispronounced your name, Rebecca, I'm so sorry, Wolf-Kyle? Yay, who's the Executive Director of the Association. We also have one of our wonderful Lifespan Respite Grantees from the Aging and Long-Term Support Administration and the Washington State Department of Social Health Services. We have both Dana Allard-Webb and Jeannie Delaplane. So welcome to all of you. And when we get to your presentation, please feel free to embellish on your introduction and tell us other wonderful things about you and the work that you do. Next slide, please. Just a quick overview of what we hope to accomplish today. Again, because so many of us are coming from different places and experience with respite and caregiving, I'm just going to have a couple of slides that I'll do right off the bat on what is respite and why is it important. I'll then turn it over to my colleagues, Becky and Susan, to talk about the respite and caregiving needs of individuals with brain injury and their family caregivers. They're going to also share some really wonderful resources from the Brain Injury Network. Then I'll come back on for a few slides to talk about what is the Lifespan Respite Care Program and some opportunities to partner with those programs to expand services to your constituents. And then we'll have this wonderful example from a great partnership between a Lifespan Respite Care Program and their TBI Council in Washington State. Next slide, please. I always like to start off with this slide because people have a lot of very different concepts about what respite is. And certainly during this COVID pandemic that we've been through, respite has evolved and changed, and there are lots of alternatives to respite that provides support to family caregivers. But for the conversation today, we will be talking a little bit about COVID too, but we're going to refer back to the definition of respite that's included in the Lifespan Respite Care Act. And that is planned or emergency care provided to a child or adult with special needs in order to provide temporary relief to family caregivers who are caring for that child or adult. And as you can see, this is a very broad definition and an inclusive definition of respite. The goal and the intent being not to leave anybody out who has a disability or chronic condition, regardless of their age. Next slide, please. And I think all of you probably know why respite is important, or you wouldn't be on the webinar today, but we are learning from the research and from lots of anecdotal evidence that the benefits of respite are quite expansive. We know fairly well that respite is a significant helper in reducing stress among family caregivers. And when we reduce our stress levels, we impact our physical and emotional health. Respite can also, by allowing family caregivers the time to engage with other family members, with their neighbors, with their faith community, that they have a chance to enhance relationships and reduce social isolation. And we've all heard so much the last couple of years about the extreme negative effects of social isolation and loneliness on our health and well-being. And so this is a really critical component of what and the role that respite can help play in reducing social isolation. And then of course, we don't want to forget about our care recipients. Because if they're not enjoying respite, if they're not benefiting from respite, if they're not comfortable in their respite situation, then the caregiver is not going to be able to relax and enjoy all the long-term benefits of respite as well. So that in a nutshell is what is respite and why is it so important? And I think now we move on to the next slide, and I can, I did want to talk a little bit about nationally, what is access? I know that people who have brain injury and their caregivers really have limited access to respite, but you should know nationally, it's a huge problem. Of the 53 million family caregivers who are out there, about only 14% of them say they use respite. Those many more say it would be very helpful. And as the intensity of their caregiving expands, so does their desire to have respite and their feeling that it would be helpful. And though we know respite is supposed to be a preventive service, unfortunately, of those who do receive respite, they're all often getting too little of it, and they're getting it too late in their caregiving experience. We're starting to learn that there may even be a therapeutic dose of respite that's the most beneficial to family caregivers. We also know that the earlier it's received in the caregiving experience, before family caregivers enter crisis mode, again, the more helpful and beneficial it will be. So that just paints a little bit of a national picture of respite for the general caregiving population. Next slide. And now I'm very happy to turn it over to Rebecca from the National Association for State Health Injury Administrators.
Thank you so much, Jill. We are so excited to partner with you all on this important webinar. Already I've learned from you, Jill, and I'm anxious for our community to learn even more throughout the next hour or so. As Jill mentioned, I am Rebecca Wolfkiel. I'm the Executive Director of the National Association of State Head Injury Administrators, NASHIA, and joined with me today is Susan Vaughn, our Director of Public Policy. Susan's also the founder of our association and has been involved over 30 years while our organization has grown and provided more services to the brain injury community. I've been in this role for a little over 3 years and have been involved with NASHIA longer than that, for about a decade, promoting public policy to support the brain injury community and specifically help states build systems of care to support those individuals. Next slide, please. So NASHIA is a national nonprofit trade association. We represent state government employees and state government programs that are building systems of care to support individuals with brain injury and their families. Next slide, please. Our organization provides membership to both state government, state employees, and also the partners that they work with in each state. It truly is takes a village to support families living with brain injury. And we look at membership as very inclusive and understand that community providers, researchers, advocacy organizations, and state programs that work in conjunction with the brain injury program are vital pieces of the brain injury continuum of care. And we welcome everyone to become members of NASHIA. Next slide. We provide a variety of resources to our states and our members and the brain injury community. Most importantly, we really provide resources and information. We have a very robust website that we're always continually providing and adding more resources to. We have a very robust training and education portfolio. We do monthly webinars, actually usually even more than monthly webinars that are free to the public and dig into specific areas that impact brain injury or specific populations that are most impacted by brain injury. We help to make connections between state governments and their partners. We'll talk about how state governments approach brain injury very differently. And so it's really important for states to be able to ask questions from one another and learn from one another so that they can better approach specific areas related to brain injury. We promote national and state trends, and we are quite involved in advocacy at the federal level, working to provide and advocate for increased federal funding for our federal ACL TBI state grant partnership program, the CDC TBI brain injury program, and other programs that we know that our community utilizes, and including the Respite program. Next slide, please. We do provide a lot of training and technical assistance to our states and our members in the community. We have an annual conference every year that brings together states from around the country, but also, again, their partners that they're working with to learn from one another. I mentioned our webinars, and we have developed, in addition to doing specific TA with states to help them build their infrastructure, we have developed some specific programming as well where we see need. So just this year, we launched our first Leading Practices Academy that's focused right now on criminal and juvenile justice. That is a population that we know there's a significant amount of individuals living with brain injury in the justice system. And so making sure that the justice community understands that they are working with folks with brain injury, how to identify them and provide resources is really important. And we help states partner with that system to build out their infrastructure. We're hoping to have additional Leading Practices Academy in the future on other topics. And so potentially after today, we'll have some ideas for some different topics as well. Next slide, please. And these are some of the very specific resources and materials that our association puts out. So in addition to our website, we also put out regular newsletters, both a Washington Weekly newsletter that talks about policy related issues and a membership newsletter that sort of gives a more broad overview of what our association's been working on and prioritizing. We also do host on our website a state contact list so that, again, when someone in one state, New Mexico, say, wants to reach out to someone in Massachusetts and they don't know who the right person is, they're able to look on our website, find the appropriate contact, and reach out directly. Next slide, please. We do partner with our federal agencies as well. We are proud to be a subcontractor on the ACL TBI State Partnership Technical Assistance Center. So NASHIA provides direct support to the state grantees that are receiving money from ACL. We also are part of the AOD Disability Employment TA Center, and we really bring that perspective and voice of brain injury, as there are very unique needs and challenges associated with the brain injury community and supports needed to get folks back to work and to stay employed. And we're also proud to partner on the NCAPS program, which is a multi-agency funded person-centered practices federal program. And again, our role is to bring brain injury expertise into the mix. Next slide. Some of the examples of direct support that we can provide to states and that we do quite routinely. Our states typically have an advisory council that helps direct the focus of their activities, and often they do kind of select specific areas of focus. So we help with advisory board development, training, sustainability practices, and there is this real move to ensuring that 50% of advisory councils are made up of people with brain injury, and helping states move to that direction in a really meaningful way is something that we've been involved with. States also, in conjunction with their advisory council, put together state strategic plans. And so we enjoy going in and helping the advisory council determine what that plan is going to look like and what the goals and objectives really are for their program over the next several years. We look for additional funding mechanisms in the state, and also look for programs, again, like yours, where there are state programs that are supporting people with brain injury, really connecting the dots so that the state brain injury person is working in conjunction with those other programs, so that everyone sort of understands that they are serving people with brain injury, and there are some unique needs that often need to be addressed. Next slide, please. These are some of the multiple funding sources that our programs often take advantage of or hope to take advantage of to support their state programs. I think I failed to mention at the outset that our state programs are very unique in each state, and not one program looks the same in each state. And so, from the number of folks that are in the program, from the number of services that are provided through the state program, and even to where the program is housed in state government, is different in every single state. Some of our states, the TBI or brain injury program is located in their vocational rehabilitation agency. Some it's in their mental health agency. Some are in public health or the disability and aging agency. So it really spans the gamut, and we try really hard to identify where those folks are, meet them where they are. It could be a part-time person that has an array of other services and programs that they're managing, or it could be, a whole team of folks that have developed some very mature infrastructure. It varies in each state. Again, we try to help support the states where they're at. And here are just a number of different funding mechanisms that states have been able to access over the years to help support and build their infrastructure. Next slide, please.
That's into mine.
Oh, this is you, Susan?
Yeah,
I'm
that's
sorry.
okay.
Oh my gosh. So sorry, Susan. I'm going to pass it over to Susan now to take it. I'm sorry, Susan. My bad.
No, I was listening. I was going to figure out what I could learn from you on our state programs. But that's okay. I was trying to figure out how do I interrupt here. But I am retired from state government in Missouri. I live in Jefferson City, Missouri. And we started our programs. If you back up a slide with the state programs, I was going to tell you a little history here. The slide before, we started in Missouri in 1985 with our state appropriation. And I just wanted to say that just as no two people, we always say there's no two people with brain injury alike, there are really no two states alike as to what they have to offer and what that looks like from state to state, for many of the reasons that Becky just said and explained. We are like many disability and organizations or movements. It did really start with a family member. It started with a mom, with Marilyn Spivak in 1980. It's similar to other disability fields where Marilyn could not find the services she needed for her daughter with brain injury, and she's from Massachusetts. So Massachusetts they started in 85, just like Missouri did. And the reason we did is Maryland started what was the National Head Injury Foundation. And I'm getting a notice that my internet is unstable. Are you hearing me okay? Nodding.
We are now. It was a little spotty, but I think you're in good shape now.
Okay, so I had a note. So it's a good thing Becky, you may have to pick up and talk again if I get another notice that my internet is unstable. But I just wanted to point out that it's really the families that push the states and government to do something because their needs are not being met. And that's what happened into our field as well, starting in 1980. And then many of the states then were urged and advocated to do something in the field of brain injury. Our families are the caregivers. I think you all know that are in the caregiving field. That's who provides most of the care. This is different. Often the son, daughter, but in instances, spouse and women, they're often providing caregiving as well as working and providing for their kids, their family, and their home. And there's a lot of stress starting from the time of hospitalization or the time of injury, where people are faced with having to cope and figure out what to do next after someone's injured. So that was why the states were urged to come in and help out families with figuring out how to get the rehabilitation and services needed and supports needed and help them to figure out how to do that. There was such a need there. So some of our states did start with the state appropriation. Some of our states came in later with trust fund programs, and that's something that's kind of a different scenario than I think with other disability fields. It started with Pennsylvania with their catastrophic fund in the 80s and getting a designated fund from derived from traffic fines. And I say that is something a little different and unique to brain injury than, say, developmental disabilities or mental health, where states were urged to find some way to pay for some of the services that may be needed. And that's what's happened. A lot of states have used that as a way to generate some money into their programs. And then most people are familiar with the home team-based waiver programs. Our states came along a little later in the 80s to try to develop some resources for those who are eligible for Medicaid. And more recently with the state plan, home and community-based services state plan option. And then other states, a few states like Missouri and Massachusetts have multiple funding sources. So they have all those streams. So they can serve people that are non-Medicaid eligible as well as those who are Medicaid eligible. Now you can go to the next slide. Please, thank you. And I just wanted to talk about the trust fund program if you're not familiar with it. Most have designated the traffic related fines to generate money for their programs. Some have done boating fines. Some have put assessment on surcharges on a driver's license. We have a few states who got the legislation passed but did not come up with a way to pay for it. A couple of states have done it and gotten another appropriation and used that. What's unique about this is, though, it puts it in a non-revolving account in government so that it can accumulate across state fiscal years. The purposes of these funds vary so much, and they generate such a wide difference. It can be as small as $500,000 a year to over $1 million. It can be used for, in some states, for post-acute rehabilitation. Other states use it for an array of services, even to pay for care coordination and service coordination services. Other states provide grants through their community agencies for public information. So I'm going to have some slides in here that has maps of where some of these programs are. And Jill said all this has been PDF'd and put on her website. But Becky also talked about our state contact list that we try to keep updated. So if you want to look to see what you have in your state, you can go to that too to figure out if your state has a program. Next slide, please. This is where these trust fund programs are. In Hawaii, it's called a neurotrauma trust fund. And so you may find some little nuances that vary from state to state as to what that looks like. Next slide, please. Our waiver programs are these states. If you notice the numbers in the parentheses, that's because they have more than one waiver for brain injury. Massachusetts has 3 of them, Connecticut 2, Kentucky 2. But again, they vary from being as small as serving 20 people and as large as serving over 1,000. Most of these states have used level of care as nursing home, and that has been often a lower rate. That's made it difficult for states to come up with a package of services to support people in the community based on those rates. That's one of the stickling points I think has been around for brain injury. These service packages look very similar to the developmental disability waivers, which means they may include in-home support.
Check that out. I'm thinking that to the Tony.
Somebody needs to mute. I don't think that's me. Thank you. I was worried that was me that was causing the problem here, but I think it was someone else. So they may have in-home support, personal care, and respite may be one of those pieces of services. But I do not know how that plays out from the states, how much they're paying for respite or how they're implementing that piece. But almost all the states have respite as part of that package to support families. Next slide, please. These are 3 states where I have 1115 waivers. Those states did have a separate brain injury home and community-based services waiver. Now they're in one of those big 1115 waivers. So they still have services that's a component of that waiver that's specific for brain injury. And then the 1915I waiver in North Dakota is a state plan home and community-based it's not a waiver, it's a home and community-based services. Usually the 1915I states are designed for people, for states to address behavioral issues. In North Dakota, they actually included people with brain injury. So that's another source of revenue, and it's children and adults that will have a package of services that can be funded through their state Medicaid plan. And then Oregon has the distinction, I think there's only about a handful of states that have a K section 1915K, which is also a state plan Medicaid service. It's administered by their Aging and Disability Office. They cannot really serve people based on diagnosis. It's based on home and community-based services needs. They serve quite a few people with what they call complex needs of people with brain injury. So that's another big package of services with Medicaid. So there's a little bit of inroads in here to try to bring brain injury into some other these provisions. Next slide, please. And that's what this looks like. So I did this map, and every time I do these maps, I think, oh, because as soon as I do them, somebody writes me and tells me out of state, or I colored a state wrong. So I'm just saying that right now we're in the process of updating all this information into a guide. So hopefully we'll have it right one of these days. But as you can imagine, this information just changes constantly as the states change their service packages. Next slide, please. Okay, Becky's already alluded to these that's okay, because what I'm going to say is these programs may be located in these agencies, but sometimes they have they're split among these agencies. So like in Minnesota, you can have the trust fund program over in the health department, and the Medicaid waiver program is over the Medicaid agency. Whereas in Missouri and Massachusetts, it has all of them housed under one umbrella. So when you're hunting and looking in your state to see if there's somebody, something that's going on program-wise for brain injury, you may have to check more than one agency. I do that a lot when I'm trying to update or locate people. I tend to want to check a couple different agencies because it's not always so clearly defined as you might say with developmental disabilities, intellectual and development disabilities, where it's all generally housed under one division. Now, that's not to say that people don't work across agencies for other types of services. I'm just talking about the main program that may be responsible for providing individuals with brain injury services. But this is kind of where our programs that Becky talked about, our membership, where our state people are, that are primarily responsible for brain injury services are located. Next slide, please. So I'm going to skip over to our federal program. Jill talked about, you all had a federal Lifespan Care Act that funds some resources for respite care. We've had since 1996. Is that the right year? Oh my gosh, where did I get 2016? Since 1996, at least got the 6 right. We've had the Traumatic Brain Injury Act that authorized for the first time some funding to help states develop services. There's another piece to that federal program that I didn't put in here to emphasize, but there is a piece or provisions in that act for authorization for funding for Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, to do some data and surveillance and public education and awareness and prevention. But for our interest primarily, it has authorization for grants to states to improve services. And in the beginning of that act in 1996, it assigned the program administration to Health Resources and Services Administration, known as HRSA. So for HRSA administered the state grant program. The law itself requires an advisory board. A lot of states had advisory councils and boards in place prior to the act. It was set up in state legislation. It requires state match. And then in 2014, when it was reauthorized, HRSA was eliminated as the administering agency, and it was left up to Health and Human Services to decide. We advocated, we as NASHIA and stakeholders advocated for the program to be located in the Administration for Community Living. It was fairly new then, but we thought it made sense to house it with other disability resources and be able to maximize resources, especially at a state and local level where there tends to be silo programs. If you're not careful, this is a way we could help kind of prevent that from happening by people working together to make resources to work. So that's basically the requirements of that program that was last reauthorized in 2018. Next slide, please. So these are the what the funds can be used for. And I left out some of the subsections that basically talked about for people with brain injury and their families to be an integral part of this process, because I just wanted to show that these grant funds can be used for the way it was set up in law for really broad things. That's to change, to develop and improve community-based services, to focus outreach to unserved and inappropriately served individuals. Next slide, please. And number C was to allow you to contract with nonprofit entities. A lot of our states contract with their state associations on brain injury or their state alliances, or in Alabama, it's the Head Injury Foundation, as a way to partner within their states to do some outreach. Some of them do resource facilitation, information referral. And then C is also talks about the need that the funds could be used for consumer family service access for training, consumer support, peer mentoring, and parent-to-parent programs. So you can see that these funds can, depending on the administering agency, it's pretty broad in how the federal or how Congress set up this federal law. So the next slide, please. Becky mentioned the TARC. With the ACL TBI State Partnership Program, they do fund the Technical Assistance Center. In their first, I guess it was their first time to award grants. They inherited the HRSA grants when they were set up, but they set up a provision for mentor and partner grants. Since 1997, since this grant program has been in place, It's never really looked the same twice, really. The grants have been called different things over the years. They have been 1-year grants, 2-year grants, 3-year grants. They have had different priorities, I guess you would say, depending on the year and the administering agency. So that's one thing I think is a little different than maybe some of the other federal grant programs where they have a history of being similar from year to years. Our hasn't been. It's had some flexibility to look at what families, individuals, and the states are needing in their states to be able to adapt those grants to that. Our grants are expiring right now, and our FOAs are out, just like with the respite care grants. We have our funding opportunities out now, and they're switching to a 5-year grant. And the awards are going to be between $170,000, $260,000, and they're not going to do the mentor and partner grant concept that they did the last go around. And the due date's May 27th. Next slide, please. So the partnership program, this is the overall, they have like 4 goals. I looked at their FOA yesterday about what their goals were of the state grant program. And I just wanted to highlight their first goal is to increase collaboration and coordination of state level activities across systems and supports. And I think that's something we're trying to emphasize today across these federal programs and how that can be carried out at a state level. Next slide, please. These are the current grantees, partner grant states and mentor states. I'm not sure all these states are applying for funds next year. So that'll be interesting to, or this year, it'll be interesting to see who among existing states will apply and who may be new. Over the years, we've only had 2 states that have not had a federal grant. All the states but 2. And I think we've had 1 territory, it seems like, in District of Columbia, that have all been awarded a grant somewhere along the almost 25-year history of the federal program. So it's always nice to see who steps forward and what their activities are going to be and who's going to apply and what's that going to look like. Next slide, please. I laid out what the requirements were under federal law, but there are some things that have taken hold with regard to the administering agencies. This started with HRSA, where they wanted a designated lead agency, meaning a state agency that is responsible for programs and services for people with brain injury. That's kind of evolved over a year to sometimes that's looked at as a designated lead agency for okay, so somebody asked me just a second. Somebody asked me what 2 states have never received a grant. Now I'm going to have to go and the brains of my recess and my brains here. It seems like South Dakota is one of them, and I'm thinking Louisiana is the other one. But I'm not going to go to the bank on that, but that's what I'm remembering. Is this recorded? I guess it is recorded, isn't it? Now I'm on record, but I think those are the 2 states. The lead agency now, in some states, the state governor has allowed universities to be that lead in terms of the grantee. So it's not always been what we consider a state agency. Most is starting out with HRSA. They did the needs and resources assessment in order to develop the state plan that Becky talked about. ACL last time took on something a little different when they came up with topical work groups, where states that had interests that were similar did work groups and did products. I think that's in the FOA again for next year. So if there's multiple states working on improved linkages with families to services or employment issues or home and community-based services, they could collectively work together to try to figure out how to do that. Okay, next slide. So this is my kind of last slide before I turn it over to Becky. And because I wanted to reinforce the notion of advisory boards and councils in the states that do planning, whether they have a grant or don't have a grant, because many of those trust fund programs, legislation requires to have an advisory board or council to work with those funds and to have a plan. And so I did ask Missouri if, since I'm here, if they included respite as one of their items to assess the need for, and they did, and it's in here. it's right in the middle in terms of satisfaction. So that's an opportunity for those seeking respite care grants to maybe check in with advisory councils if they haven't already, to see if that's been identified as a need and how collectively or how you could work together to make that better for caregivers. And I would say same thing with our advisory councils and boards and programs. It's a good time now with FOAs out to see if your state groups are looking to do one of the Respite Care Coalition grants and how you can partner to advance that. Because as I said earlier, caregivers are the primary provider for people with brain injury. So anything we can do to help provide some respite for those folks, I think is very beneficial. So Becky, I'm going to let you be the cleanup hitter.
Great. Next slide, please. So I just want to sort of reemphasize what Susan just mentioned. Our TBI ACL program FOAs are also out on the streets, and we know that ACL feels really strongly about collaboration of their programs. And I hope that if nothing else, you know, this starts to get your wheels turning about potentially partnering respite programs and TBI programs and including those partnerships in either the TBI or the respite FOAs that are out. I think those types of partnerships are exactly what ACL is looking to do. And if we could get some great state models, we'd love to amplify those and promote them so that more states could replicate. So with that, I think we'll take a pause and we look forward to the rest of the speakers and then answering questions at the end.
Great, thank you so much, Susan and Becky. That was really some fantastic information. And I want to reiterate right off the top of what you've just said, that we encourage those same partnerships. And I think the fact that we both have FOAs open right now within the Administration for Community Living provides some really excellent opportunities to begin those discussions and formalize some of those partnerships and grants moving forward. So thank you very, very much. Next slide, please. Next, you can go to the next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Lifespan Respite Care Program, how it came to be, and for those of you in the Brain Injury Network who are looking to partner with the Lifespan Respite Grantees, you'll have a little bit of background on the program. We've already talked a little bit about what are the respite barriers that are out there that are across universally for all family caregivers, but I think are probably exacerbated among this population. Just off the top, right away, we can all say there's not enough government funding. Even though we've heard a lot about home and community-based Medicaid waivers and other funding sources, it's not enough to provide the formal service system that family caregivers really would rely on for respite. And then there's the personal cost to the family and to the caregiver, especially if the person's caregiving needs require expenditures beyond normal household expenditures, or if a caregiver has had to give up employment in order to stay home and provide care. The cost of respite can really seem like a luxury and prohibitive. But we know, and I think this is really probably true for this population as well, that even when families have the resources to pay for care, they can't find the qualified, well-trained providers that would make them feel comfortable about using respite. And that's, you know, we're in the middle of a direct service worker crisis as it is. And in the respite arena, I think it's even more difficult to find the providers that we need. And that's coupled with just the fact that there are very limited respite options out there, the type of respite that family caregivers would prefer, whether it's in-home services or out-of-home services. And there are so many different models of respite. Probably the greatest shortages are among overnight, weekend, and extended respite are often extremely difficult to find still. And then, of course, there are among caregivers, again, this is universal, it's exacerbated and worse among certain populations, but a general reluctance to use respite. reluctance to ask for help, or even to identify as a caregiver. You know, those of us who do caregiving, we think of ourselves as the daughter, the spouse, the sibling, who of course is going to be providing this care. We don't say that we're caregivers, and therefore we don't know that there are caregiver support services out there because we're so focused on providing care to our loved ones. So that's a big issue. And then of course, all the hardcore access issues, limited transportation, especially when it's out of home respite, a lack of information about where to find services, where to get the funding. And then I think that Susan and Becky really talked about this so well in their presentation, the multiple funding streams that are coming out of various agencies, multiple agencies. That's exactly true about respite also. Respite may be funded through the Public Health Agency, through the Child Welfare Agency, through the Aging Agency, through the Disability Agency. And so it really becomes a bureaucratic maze that caregivers have to wade through to find services. Next slide. Becky's already talked, and Susan have talked a lot about how we pay for respite for this population. There are other supports out there as well. The largest source of federal funding for respite are through those Medicaid home and community-based waivers. And I did post in the chat a document that we have that focuses on the respite components of over 200 Medicaid waivers, including the Medicaid waivers for the TBI population. So you can get from that document very specific information about how your state waiver pays for respite, who are the eligible providers, how do you apply for services. So I hope that new resource will be useful to you. There's the Family Caregiver Support Program, which is also run out of the Administration for Community Living. And if the person in care is over the age of 60, regardless of what their condition is, they would be eligible for caregiver supports, including respite care. As you probably all know, there are a wide variety of veterans programs that pay for in-home services and respite care through geriatrics and home care, through the comprehensive program for veterans that's now going to be available to veterans from all eras. It's a very generous program. If you're caring for someone who is a veteran or in the military, there's now also free respite available from the Elizabeth Dole Foundation. We're going to be doing a little webinar on that next week, a short informational webinar from the Dole Foundation about how you can access those free respite dollars for veterans in your care. And then, you know, there's a whole range of disability and private aging organizations that provide respite. And so many of the majority of family caregivers and their care recipients probably don't qualify or participate in publicly funded programs at all. And so then they're forced to self-pay for respite, or if they're among the very, very few that have long-term care insurance, respite is often covered under long-term care as well. And then finally, what I'm going to talk about today is the Lifespan Respite Care program. Next slide. And Lifespan is defined as coordinated systems of accessible community-based respite services for all family caregivers. And it really was designed to get at all of those barriers that I just mentioned. By coordinating across agencies, by coordinating across community services, and simply making it easier for family caregivers to find and use services. Next slide. In a nutshell, the program is administered out of ACL, just like the TBI programs, through competitive grants. It's a very small program, so there's not enough funding to do a formula grant to all states. Since 2009, 37 states and the District of Columbia have received at least one Lifespan Respite Care grant. And I usually have a map too, but just like Susan said, it's changing so often that it's hard to keep up with coloring in those states on the map. And it's going to be changing again with the new funding opportunity announcement that's coming out. But those grants allow states a fair amount of flexibility in what they do with those funds, but there are 4 required uses. The first one is to develop those statewide coordinated systems to actually provide some respite services, planned and emergency respite. To get at that provider capacity issue, states are required to use at least some of their funds for training and recruitment of providers and volunteers. And then very critically to make sure that caregivers are getting the information about how to access respite. Next slide, please. Just again, a very big forest view of Lifespan Respite Grant activities. Many states started out building those statewide coordinated systems and building their infrastructure. And that involved maybe doing an environmental scan and figuring out where all the public and private funding sources were for respite in the state, across state agencies in the community. Using that information to build statewide respite registries that they very often house on their Aging and Disability Resource Center No Wrong Door System website, or on something like a 211 website, or perhaps their own State Respite Coalition website. So there are various statewide registries, and most of the grantees have one or are building one. They're all working on making sure they have a mechanism or an infrastructure to connect families to respite and to these funding sources. And when it comes to providing direct services, the majority of the grantees are providing limited funding through consumer-directed respite voucher programs, which they may also call stipend, grant, or reimbursement programs that help family caregivers pay for respite. And then the family caregiver can hire a respite provider from their own networks of family and friends, or in some states, like in Washington State, you'll be hearing a little bit about this, families are free to choose from a vetted list of trained providers. So it may function a little bit differently in all states, but the concept is the same, of providing financial assistance to family caregivers. Again, to build around capacity, some states have used their funds to award mini grants to community and faith-based organizations to build volunteer and faith-based respite initiatives. Many, especially now, are focused on recruiting and training respite providers, making sure that they're going through training before they add them to their statewide respite registries. And I think this is where, even though their funding is so small, beginning to build that cadre and pool of respite providers is going to be critical as we move forward. If we really want respite to be available, we have to have and make providers available. Next slide, please. Again, Susan and Becky did a great job of letting our network know how to connect to all of their state contacts. We have similar pages on our website that will connect you to a state respite coalition. A state respite coalition is a mandatory partner in a Lifespan Respite Grant, and the coalitions are very often composed of various aging and disability state organizations, home care providers, respite programs, family caregivers, advocates, policymakers. So they're wonderfully diverse groups, and they're always looking for new partners. And our hope with this webinar today is to encourage some of your folks from the Brain Injury Network to participate in these coalitions, so we can start to speak about respite with one voice. Again, those coalitions work in collaboration with the state grantee, and the state grantee is housed either in the agency that administers the Older Americans Act, the Medicaid agency, or it can be any agency that's designated by the governor. So we also have been housed in developmental disabilities agencies and public health agencies. So there, again, just like the TBI program, there's some variety there on who is the lead. But you can find those contacts on our webpage. Next slide, please. During the pandemic, I mentioned earlier that, things have changed a bit. The one thing that hasn't changed is that respite has remained maybe or perhaps the only connection that family caregivers have had to outside services and supports. And so it has remained very critical for them, whether they've been comfortable in continuing with in-home respite through voucher respite programs, or actually been able to connect with those community-based respite services, which have instituted strict protocols according to CDC and public health departments to stay open. And then so many of our grantees, to meet the needs of where family caregivers were and their comfort level with using respite, pivoted very rapidly, and ACL gave them lots of flexibility about how they could use their funds to provide support. But the range of support that the grantees have been utilizing are everything from weekly phone check-ins to drive-by visits, to Facebook educational programs, to online support groups, to delivery of care packages, purchasing tablets for family caregivers so that they could interact, through all of the online supports. So it's really been wonderful to work with ACL on this and see how creative our grantees have been in providing those alternative kinds of support. Next slide, please. For our programs, they really asked us, many of us want to stay open. We want to increase the comfort level of family caregivers to continue to use respite during the pandemic because it's so critical to their well-being that we convened an expert work group and developed some voluntary guidelines for providing and using respite safely during the pandemic. And this has really been wonderful in helping our respite voucher program share the information with family caregivers. There's a decision guide in the document that helps a family caregiver think through whether they feel comfortable using respite, what they would need to be more comfortable. And we continue to make these resources available to family caregivers and are adopting them as the guidances have been changing as well. To make these guidelines more pragmatic for everyone's use and to share lived experiences of respite providers, we've done a series of case studies on exactly how, what were the steps that certain programs took to make sure that they could continue to reopen or continue to provide respite services, with everything from, how to secure PPE to how do we adjust our voucher programs so that they're more flexible and families feel more comfortable using them. And the case studies, we looked at an adult day program, several respite voucher programs, some strong community-based respite services that are functioning within the community, and in-home respite providers as well. So there's a range of respite models that talk about how they are providing services safely now. And hopefully into the future, because I don't think things are going to change very dramatically in the near future. So we have to be prepared for all types of respite models moving forward. Next slide. Again, this is how you can connect with ARCH. If you want to learn more about the accomplishments of the grantees, we just this week released a wonderful new report called In Support of Caregivers, Key Accomplishments of Lifespan Respite Programs. And I will put the link to that in the chat so that you can have more information. And it includes ways that programs have pivoted to provide services during the pandemic as well. Next slide. I'm now going to turn it over to an example of a Lifespan Respite grantee who for a number of years now has been able to partner with their TBI colleagues in Washington State. So I turn it over to Dana and to Jeannie.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Jeannie Delaplane, and I have the pleasure of being the Kinship Care and Lifespan Respite Program Manager for Washington State. But also with me is our Lifespan Respite Director, Dana Allard-Webb. And I just want to thank you all for asking us to come and share a little bit about Lifespan Respite in Washington and our partnership with the TBI Council. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk just briefly about Lifespan Respite in Washington, and then move on to our partnership with TBI, and then talk to you about something new we've been doing as a result of our partnership with TBI, and that's a virtual support group on the Hey Peers platform. Next slide. So the technical stuff, right? So Lifespan Respite. What is it in Washington State? Well, it's short-term care provided to unpaid caregivers. It all began back in 2002, and it was it had a very long title back then. It was called Respite and Crisis Care Coalition of Washington. And as it grew and grew, in 2012, we received our, we renamed to Lifespan Respite, so we call it LRW. And then in this last September, we received our 6th grant fund for the next 3 years from the Aging Administration of Community and Living. So in Washington, we don't necessarily do the Lifespan Respite from the state. We have a host agency, and our host agency is PAVE, Partnership for Action, Voices for Empowerment. They are a fantastic partner. They are so enthusiastic about respite that it really makes it easy to work with them. So the PAVE staff, they administer the Lifespan Respite Voucher Program for unpaid, unserved families. And it's for the entire state. Go ahead to next slide. To access Lifespan Respite, individuals go to the webpage. And so I've given you a picture of what it looks like. And so the voucher program, you go here, Lifespan Respite, and you have a couple of places that you can go. You can go to either the voucher program, and it gives a wonderful explanation. But what's really fun is the respite care resources, and you can go and it filters you in, and you can select by county and any specialties that you might be looking for. It's a fantastic tool to locate respite. So how does that work? So eligibility for our vouchers. So the vouchers are up to $1,000, and in order to qualify, you have to be unpaid caregiver, provide more than 40 hours or more a week of support to an individual with a special need, live in Washington, and then not enrolled in any other program that would pay for respite services, unless you're on a wait list that's longer than 30 days, and then we can talk about that. And you're unable to afford respite in general on your own. Go ahead and next slide. So in Washington, we have this little RCW statute. We have a statute that guides how we do this. And so in Washington State, we require all of our caregivers that do respite to be trained. They have to go through a training partnership through the SEIU union. It's a 70-hour training. There's an extensive background check, and then there's yearly continuing education. There is no way around this. It is an absolute, and the training partnership does an excellent job of putting together those trainings. Now, if it is a camp or a recreation program or something like that, individuals are not required to go through this training, but they have their own standards that are pretty stringent. Go ahead and next slide. So who can provide respite? Well, there's a lot of folks. Even though we have such tight rules on the training, there's still a lot of folks. And so it can be home care agencies, adult homes, daycare providers, childcare, summer park recreation programs, independent providers. There's a lot of folks out there. We refer to our providers as RPAs, Respite Provider Agencies. And so this is an organization that people would go through, and they would access it from our webpage and sort. And if somebody isn't, if you were a care receiver and a caregiver, and you were looking for respite, and there wasn't somebody already set up to do it in your area or they could go through the process with PAVE and become one of our RPA providers. Go ahead and next slide. So where can respite be, right? So where can respite be provided? Pretty much anywhere in the community. Somebody in your home, maybe you go to a group center. There's all sorts of places that you could go. It just isn't limited to in your home. The only real true limit that we place on our respite in Washington is the training component. So that's your general, real high level overview of Lifespan Respite in Washington. And so now we're going to hear from Dana. And I just want you guys to know Dana has been instrumental in forming partnerships with the Traumatic Brain Injury Council and has been really the forefront leader on developing all of the stuff we've been trying. So Dana, on to you. Oh, I don't hear you.
Thank you. Now do you hear me?
Yes.
So I'm Dana Allard-Webb, and besides getting to work with Jeannie on the Lifespan Respite grants in Washington, I'm the Family Caregiver Support Program Manager for the state. And I also sit on the Advisory Council for TBI as the representative from DSHS. So can you change the slide, please? Advance, thank you. So our Lifespan Respite grant partners with the Traumatic Brain Injury, and the Traumatic Brain Injury Council coordinator sits in Aging and Long-Term Support Administration with Jeannie and I. So it was a very natural partnership because part of the traumatic brain injury mandate by our legislature is to serve caregivers and partner with other state Union on Aging programs. And Family Caregiver Support Program and Kinship also play in our partnership, and also PAVE, as Jeannie was talking about. They are our host and a great partner for us. Next slide, please. So when we started working with the TBI Council coordinator 3.5 years ago, at the beginning of the 2017 Lifespan Respite Grant that we received in Washington, we partnered through the TBI Council with 2 contracted agencies that the TBI Council had. And they are the main groups who assist people with TBIs and their caregivers. So for our first and second year, we really tried hard to reach out and interest people in vouchers and interest caregivers in services that came along with Lifespan Respite. So we talked with the TBI coordinator and the grant staff and staff from PAVE, made presentations to lots of interested groups. Our goal was to talk about the value of respite and self-care for family caregivers. We talked to people, our outreach included tribal communities, council members, also helped with disseminating to their organizations all the information that we wanted to convey. David Miner, the TBI Council coordinator, and I made presentations to the Office of Deaf and Hard of Hearing, to their advocates, their caregiver advocates, and we also spoke and had information at many relevant conferences, including the TBI conference, the National TBI conference. So after about a year, the 2 contracted organizations that serve people with TBI reported that the caregivers overwhelmingly were telling them that they didn't trust that paid caregivers coming into their home would understand the behaviors and particular issues that were related to their care receivers with TBI. So the caregivers said they wouldn't really be able to relax while away because they'd be so worried about the behaviors and issues that their that their care receivers had, and they just didn't trust that paid caregivers would be able to handle some of those issues. Next slide, please. So we, with that information, we developed and offered a TBI paid caregiver training that was adopted by the training partnership. And Jeannie talked a little bit about the training partnership, and which is the way people become paid caregivers in Washington. The TBI training was developed and is now offered as an option to satisfy a portion of those 12 hours of continuing education that each certified paid caregiver has to take every year. Our grant partner, PAVE, then developed a listing process to list the paid caregivers who had taken that TBI training. And then we offered those TBI trained paid caregivers to the unpaid family caregivers of people with TBI for respite. And we also trained the staff of those 2 contracted agencies who reach out and assist people with TBI and their family members. And there was really not a very a big increase in voucher use after all of those endeavors. So Lifespan Respite Washington still offers to this day vouchers to caregivers, and mostly through that Brain Injury Alliance, one of those contracted agencies that TBI has. And they assist families and or TBI caregivers and people with TBI with a lot of information and resources, and one of those is Lifespan Respite vouchers. There are not a great deal of TBI caregivers who take us up on those. So at that point, you know, where we were offering vouchers and we had done all of that work of training caregivers and reaching out to family caregivers of people with TBI, the TBI Council had to move on to focus on other service ideas because they have rules around their services and allocation and delivery of services that was not meeting. You know, they just were not being able to serve enough through the Lifespan Respite Washington voucher program. Next slide, please. So Jill, or I guess it's Cassandra, could you please go to the slide 11? I changed it around because I thought it made better sense. The next slide. Thank you. And then we'll go back in a minute and talk about that other one. So, but before we talk about our current relationship with TBI Council, I really want to provide a little bit of background about the Washington TBI State Advisory Council. That council was formed by the Washington State Legislature in 2007. It's really not that old. And since many TBIs are caused by traffic accidents, the funding for all of their services in the TBI that the TBI Council offers come from moving violation tickets in Washington. The council started development. Well, the council has had support groups, but they were not able to provide support groups to all of the people in Washington, or not even most of the people in Washington. So about 9-10 months ago, the council started development for a support group for a platform for people with TBI. And TBI has been providing virtual support groups for people who have a TBI for about 8 months now with really great success. They have increased the support group sessions to 4 sessions per week, and they usually have between 7 and 15 attendees at those support groups. So the support group sessions provide education and social support, and they, like Jeannie said, use the Hey Peers virtual platform, which is a really handy, slick platform, almost as good as Zoom, I think. So on the screen, you can see that this is their TBI group's information flyer, and that's distributed through area agencies on aging, by the partners of our host agency PAVE, by our Lifespan Respite Washington coalition, and then TBI council members also spread the word through their organizations and agencies that they're associated with. So the support groups are not meant as a therapy session. They are, all sessions have a trained facilitator who's actually very good at what he does. He walks the attendees through a planned training component. And the sessions also have time for discussion among the attendees at the end of the training. And the virtual platform is available to Washingtonians who have brain injuries, even in remote areas. And I am told that people sometimes attend even from outside of Washington as well. I think there's someone from Ireland and people from South Carolina and all kinds of people. So it's been really, really helpful. I don't know how those people learned about it, but I'm so happy they did. Okay, Cassandra, if you could go back one to that one that I skipped. Thank you. So among other mandates, the TBI Council is tasked to reach out and assist not only people with a TBI, but their caregivers and the rest of their family. So now the TBI Council is ready to provide support groups for the caregivers of those living with TBI. And they're partnering with us and with our family caregiver support group and providing caregiver support groups for all caregivers. So we are hoping that by having support groups and other training opportunities, for example, conferences for caregivers, that we are taking a step back and educating caregivers of people with TBI just so that they can see the value of respite and self-care through learning about things they can do to relieve stress. And with that knowledge, we really hope that more caregivers will come forward to see that respite is an option for them. Next slide, please. Whoops, okay, and one more. Ooh, oh. One more, okay. So through a grant from the federal Reconnect program through USDA, Washington has created an infrastructure that provides high-speed internet connectivity in most rural areas of Washington. And most of those Wi-Fi hotspots are in fire department parking lots, in libraries, schools, and city halls throughout Washington. So they really go down to the local level of smaller towns and other areas. Although not ideal, these hotspots allow people without internet access in their homes to participate in support groups. And in addition to that, those peer support groups can also be accessed with a phone. So the TBI Council really is trying very hard to include all people that we can. And that goes for those new family caregiver support groups as well. So one more advance, please. To the next slide, thank you. The support group pilot is for, like I said, family caregivers who are caring for all people of any age with any disability. And right now that pilot is being sponsored by the TBI Council. Those sessions are broadly based and they have a focus on education and insight into common stresses of caregivers. You can see one of our pilot sessions are very broad based and they are subjects that would be of use to all caregivers. So there's time, they also leave time, just like the TBI support groups, they leave time at the end of the family caregiver support groups for caregivers to have discussions. And there are future plans. So after the pilot, we really hope to make this a permanent program in Washington. And then in the future, we really hope to increase support group sessions as the numbers of the attendees increase, of course, and the word is spread through word of mouth and some marketing. Then also in the future, we hope to develop at some point support groups for caregivers caring for people who have specific needs. For example, Alzheimer's or other dementias, TBI, of course, and people who are caring for people with intellectual disabilities and so on. And the TBI Council has really been a huge part of that, and they will be our partner, I believe, ongoing. Next slide, please. So that is the end of our session. Are there any questions? I'm sure there are for Susan or Becky or Jeannie or me.
There were a couple of questions in the chat, so I will read them out to you. One question, a respite provider wanted to know if in Washington, caregivers are allowed to refer their own caregiver, perhaps to, I know that your voucher program is only for use of vetted programs, but is there a way for a family to identify a provider and then have them go through that vetting process to then be an eligible provider?
Yes, they can refer the person they want to become a caregiver to a caregiving agency, and their caregiving agency would take over that education, the training.
Yeah, this questioner was also wondering that if that was possible, maybe that would help encourage more caregivers of people with TBI to use the program if they could refer their own person with whom they've already developed a trusting relationship. I don't know if you explored that specifically, and I'm sure you did. You talked about, offering specific training. Okay. Someone was asking, and I'm assuming they're referring to those to you in Washington, if your services reach out to those in rural communities. Yes, especially the TBI Coalition or the TBI Council. They have council members in most parts of Washington, and they're very careful to not only reach out to people who live on the huge corridor that goes up from, Oregon, California, Oregon, all the way through Tacoma and Seattle, but that we also have another side of the state over a very large mountain range. So we are always very cognizant of making sure that we are including all the people in our state. So that was one of the reasons they chose to do the Wi-Fi hotspots, because Washington has quite a few areas that are actually considered frontier areas still. So it's a big wide state with a lot of rural area. Great, thank you. If I missed anyone else's question in the chat, please feel free to unmute yourselves and ask a question. Is there anyone that has a question for any of the presenters? No questions? We will continue to collect questions for a few minutes once we close out. So please feel free, if you think of them as we're saying goodbye here. We promise to get back to you with a response via email. But I really want to thank all of our presenters so much. That was an extremely worthwhile presentation, and I was just so struck by the similarities administratively between the way the TBI program and Lifespan are run, and the encouragement of partnerships and stakeholders, and how critical that is to all the work that we do. So that was really the point of today's webinar, is to bring all of you together so you could perhaps reach out and follow up with each other and figure out ways that you can partner more effectively at the state level to bring respite to this population and to other unserved and underserved populations. I do want to remind all of you that immediately following the webinar, or perhaps already, you've received an automatic email asking you to provide some feedback to today's webinar. It's a very, very short survey, takes 2 minutes. So if you have an opportunity to just give us some feedback on today's webinar, we would really very much appreciate that. And again, stay in touch, stay in contact with us. You have all of our contact information on the slides. You will get a link to the recording, and I'll send around the slides again to all who have participated. Are there any last words any of our presenters would like to offer in closing? Final thoughts or questions you may have for each other?
Just want to say thank you. And I view this as the beginning of a partnership between our organizations, and we'll continue to lift up other great models and examples. And thank you, Jill, for facilitating this.
Again, thank you all to all of our presenters, and we look forward to doing some more work with you in additional collaboration. Thanks, everyone, and have a really great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.